Now let's go to Democratic Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who recently met with family members of hostages being held by Hamas and has been calling for a ceasefire. Congresswoman, thanks for coming back on the show. Is it fair for me to summarize your position and the position of some of your fellow progressives that you're calling for Hamas to release the hostages and for Israel and the U.S. to agree to a ceasefire?
Correct. Correct. That's absolutely correct.
And what would you say to the Israelis who say they suffered a horrific terrorist attack, over 1,400 people killed, many in gruesome ways, children killed, abducted. And so they say they're fighting a war of self-defense, a war that any other country, including the US, would fight if they were in the same position. What is your reaction to that line of argument?
I think one of the things that's important to recognize about this situation is the asymmetry of what is going on, as well as the collective punishment of what is happening to the Palestinian people at this moment. Hamas has absolutely engaged in horrific attacks, and every single day there are more details that are released about what occurred on October 7th that shocks the human consciousness and shocks our conscience, our collective conscience. However, we do know as well that war crimes do not constitute and are not an appropriate response for other war crimes. Hamas's hostage taking, their hostage taking of children, of the disabled, elderly, civilians are a war crime. But when we are talking about the blockading of water, food, electricity to a population of 2.2 million Palestinians, when we are talking about dropping what we're seeing from Human Rights Watch, reports and confirmation from organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, the dropping and deployment of white phosphorus, which is also a war crime. It is unacceptable to think that 1,700 Palestinian children alone, that their deaths will somehow make up for or justify the violence of what we saw on October 7th. You know, here in Congress, every single year we pass a defense budget, and every single year we hear about the precision, the sophistication, the technological capacities to meet targets with such precise strikes. And yet what we are seeing unfold in Gaza is an indiscriminate bombing campaign. We are seeing the dropping of white phosphorus, an indiscriminate weapon. We are seeing civilian centers being bombed. We are seeing churches. We are seeing thousands upon thousands of people being killed by these strikes. And it occurs to me, and I think a question that we all must ask ourselves is, what price of innocent life is acceptable in terms of targeting Hamas? And are we even receiving? We are receiving daily counts every day by the number of innocent people that are dying. We are not seeing reports on how effective this has actually been in terms of dismantling Hamas. I think it's very important for us to raise that point. And I think it's also very important for us to understand that this is part of a larger intergenerational cycle of violence.
So you mentioned war crimes, and Human Rights Watch did this week, said Hamas should be investigated for committing war crimes in southern Israel, as you said. But also Israel is also being accused of war crimes by both Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. Just to be clear, your view is that both sides are committing war crimes, because 95% of your colleagues in Congress won't even call for a ceasefire, let alone accuse Israel of war crimes.
I don't see how anyone can look at reputable international organizations confirming the carrying and deployment of white phosphorus by the Israeli government, the Israeli military, and say that there is no question here. In fact, Josh Paul, the State Department official that resigned publicly this week, pointed specifically to this issue, that the Leahy laws, United States Leahy laws, require the United States to assess if a government is committing war crimes or engaged in gross violations of human rights. And that must be considered in any weapons transfer or military aid assistance. And from an individual whose role directly involved the assessment and the deployment of these weapons and consideration of Leahy, he himself is saying that U.S. law
Yes.
is, in his view, being violated. And that must be an absolute consideration, because when we are talking about the role of democracy and fighting for democracy, the whole case for democracy, it lies upon and rests upon civil society,
Okay.
rule of law, and the protection of human and civil rights. And we must make our case more so in wartime than almost any other time to make the distinguishment about what makes us different.
So, Congresswoman, your critics would say that it's all well and good calling for a ceasefire, but that doesn't deal with the problem of Hamas, doesn't protect Israeli civilians from future Hamas attacks. And I wonder, for example, what is your response to Senator Schumer, Majority Leader Schumer, who suggested in remarks that Punchbowl published on Friday that those of you progressive in the House who are calling for a ceasefire or suggesting Israel is attacking hospitals are basically taking, he said, quote, Hamas's position?
You know, I have great respect for Senator Schumer, and we enjoy a very strong working relationship. This is an area, however, of disagreement. I would say that if we want to see how this is going, we can just look back at the many different cycles of violence and response. And I do not believe that it's absolutely not a defense of Hamas in order to criticize this current approach, this indiscriminate, violent approach. 1,700 children are dead. And when I think about the political aims of violence, the material aims of violence often involve the destruction of human life and much of the horror that we've seen. But many of the political aims of violence is to further radicalize and entrench both parties into further violence. And when we see people radicalized to dehumanize the Palestinian population as a result of Hamas, this is part of the goal of that political violence. And when we see the dehumanization of Israeli families as a result of this is part of the political aim. And we have to be able to get ourselves to break this cycle, because Hamas and terrorism...
Congresswoman, you would accept that a ceasefire, though, would leave Hamas in place. You would accept that's a cost of saving civilian lives in Gaza.
I think in the immediate sense, we have to have a pause in what is going on. As you mentioned, only 14 trucks have made through in humanitarian aid. We are talking about a full blockade of water for a population of 2.2 million people, 1.1 million people in northern Gaza. And we're supposed to think that 14 trucks is going to somehow in any way address what is happening in terms of the starvation, the famine, the thirst that is happening. People, I mean, we are now at a state where there is risk of cholera and other types of waterborne disease. Yes. And I mean, 14 trucks of what? Bottled water?
On that note about what's happening to them, I can't help but notice that you mentioned dehumanization, all or almost all of the at least 18 House Democrats who've called for a ceasefire in Gaza are people of color. How much of the congressional indifference to Palestinian life in Gaza, the refusal in D.C. to acknowledge sometimes the humanity and the innocence, not to mention suffering of ordinary Gazans, how much of that is driven by the fact that they're Arabs or they're mostly all Muslims or they don't look like us, do you think?
I mean, I will say that I have long found the ignoring and sidelining of Palestinians in the U.S. House of Representatives, the humanity of Palestinian populations in the 5 years that I've been in Congress quite shocking. This is not something that is new to many of us. I have engaged alongside many of my colleagues from Betty McCollum's bill on the detention, conditioning aid, and making sure that it's not going to the detention of children, to just raising the routine human rights issues. And we've been trying to raise the alarm bells around this for years. And there has been virtually no acknowledgement in the United States House of Representatives about the extreme plight and continued human rights violations of the Palestinian people for years. I found it alarming. I found it shocking. I found it shocking when in 2019 or 2020, in our first term of the House of Representatives, when Prime Minister Netanyahu banned two United States sitting members of Congress from coming to Israel, Representatives Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, banned two members of the United States Congress from entering the country, that my own colleagues did not seem to say or do much of anything. That should be an affront to our entire government and country.
So you mentioned your colleagues in the Congress. Before we run out of time, I've got to ask you about the House itself. You have no speaker right now. The Republicans defenestrated Kevin McCarthy, couldn't agree on Steve Scalise or Jim Jordan. Now Byron Donalds, congressman from Florida, wants to be speaker. What do you make of him?
He's only served one term in the U.S. House of Representatives. The last thing that he did in an oversight committee was attempt to submit falsified evidence to an impeachment hearing. I think it helps to know where all the bathrooms are before you run for the U.S. House of Representatives personally. And I think it helps to have some real experience in one of the most complex legislative bodies in the world before you try to run it.
And last question for you, just looking forward. I mean, despite Republican dysfunction, they're still doing very well in the polls, in the presidential polls. Looking forward to November 2024, especially now with this war in Gaza that seems to be alienating a few key parts of the Democratic base, young voters, progressives, Arab American voters in states like Michigan. How worried are you about Joe Biden's re-election prospects and the chances of a Donald Trump return to power?
I think we need to understand that one of the lessons that must be learned from Donald Trump's first election is that it is not sufficient and has never been sufficient to say, well, the other guy's worse. I think it's an argument that is very understandable. I understand it completely. And it is on its face correct. But where it is offensive and where I think folks sometimes lack sensitivity in that is that only some populations are asked to have their rights held hostage, to ask to have their humanity held hostage, and say we don't really need to prioritize the policy demands of these constituencies because of how much worse the opponent is. I think a Democratic coalition not just means involving protecting people from erosion, but it means actually championing and incorporating their policy priorities in our governance. We have a year, and I think it's important to demonstrate that in the year to come.
Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, thank you so much for your time tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I think in the immediate sense, we have to have a pause in what is going on. As you mentioned, only 14 trucks have made through in humanitarian aid. We are talking about a full blockade of water for a population of 2.2 million people, 1.1 million people in northern Gaza. And we're supposed to think that 14 trucks is going to somehow in any way address what is happening in terms of the starvation, the famine, the thirst that is happening. People, I mean, we are now at a state where there is risk of cholera and other types of waterborne disease. Yes. And I mean, what, 14 trucks of what? Bottled water?